want to go off-grid. This video is about my experience being off-grid as a teenager and the pros and cons of that lifestyle, and would I do it again, and if I would, what would it look like now? When I was 12, my parents moved to a 10-acre farm out in the same area that my dad had grown up in, and it had just been a cow pasture. There was no water, there was no electricity. We did have a near neighbor that had water, and if that hadn't been the case, being off-grid probably wouldn't have been a possibility. We would have had to just kind of commute while we were building our house. So when I was growing up, we initially didn't have solar panels. Again, we didn't have water, we didn't have any kind of electricity. And we lived in a little single-wide trailer with a porta potty next to it while my dad single-handedly built our home. And the challenges of that had a lot to do with the fact that there were young children in our family. I was the oldest, again, and I think I had just turned 13 by the time we got that trailer out there. And we had a wood-burning stove, and my job was to haul the water. I learned how to drive when I was 13 and could drive by myself because I was the one that would drive to the neighbors and fill up the 5-gallon buckets of water at their animal pump and then drive it back. And I thought it was this great adventure. However, that was the winter that we got to -40 degrees. Or no, that was a different winter when our calves died. Okay, so our first winter there, everything survived, but we had a normal cold winter, which in our area is about -30 is the coldest it gets, but you have several weeks there where you're at -20 Fahrenheit. And we had an outhouse, and it meant that in the winter at night you had to get up to go outside through the snow to get to the outhouse if you needed to go to the bathroom. There were 6 children, and we couldn't bathe, and that was a challenge. And also, if you got ill, if you got sick, a lot of this stuff that we take for granted that's labor-saving devices became a really big deal. For one thing, we heated any of our water that we needed on the stove to wash dishes and things like that. We didn't do laundry, and we couldn't shower or bathe in any way. Well, what if you have a child with bronchitis or breathing difficulties in the night and you wish you had a steamy bath to put him in? Well, if it's a tiny baby, it's easier to walk into the bathroom and turn the shower on and just let the steam help them breathe. When your water's heated over a wood-burning stove, what are you going to do? Hold the baby over the boiling pot of water? Or you can put a dish on the ground and put a towel over them, but and let the steam come up. But it can cause not impossibilities, but difficulties. We kept our food in an ice chest with ice, and that didn't last very long. The ice chest with the ice didn't last very long. My dad ended up going and getting a little freezer set that ran, I don't remember if it ran off propane or if he had got a solar panel up at that point, that the solar panel would keep the fridge going. We still have the fridge. I should go look. When my parents moved out of their home, they gave us their little fridge, their little fridge freezer set. So the ice chest didn't last very long. It was just too hard to feed. At that point, there were only 8 people. To feed 8 people off of what you can store in an ice chest, it was difficult. The only thing we kept in there, I think, was meat. Eventually, we got to the point where fresh fruits and vegetables had to be eaten quickly, and you don't necessarily have to refrigerate cheese. The biggest difficulty, and I'll say this, is water and cleanliness. If you have children and they're still in a public school situation and they're not able to shower every day to maintain the same level of cleanliness that the other children are able to do, it can get really, really embarrassing really, really fast. And so we would go over once a week to my grandmother's, and we would shower, we would bathe, and we would do laundry. Eventually we got one of those wringer washers, the ones that you put the wash through the wringer that squeezes the water out and everything. We had multiple tub systems, and my mom got that for free a secondhand store. When she saw somebody dumping it off to be left to be sold by the secondhand store, she stopped them and said, "Could I have that, please?" And so we got that, and it was pretty neat. And it was very loud, but eventually we were able to do our own laundry. But you still have to haul the water. The the one reason I would not be willing to go off-grid would be if I didn't have some kind of running water next to my home, because it's so heavy. Now I know this because I was the one that had to haul all the water. Twice or 3 times a day I would go down to the neighbors and haul all this water, and then it had to be hauled into the house, and it was extremely heavy for a 13-year-old girl. But I was the oldest one, I was the strongest one, and my dad was at work all day, so I had to be able to help my mom with this kind of thing. So when you're off-grid, the biggest source of exertion and exhaustion is water. Whether you're hauling it to do laundry or you're hauling it to bathe, it's heavy, and you just don't really have much of a choice if you want to be able to bathe and wash dishes and have water for drinking. I think off-grid, you want to be close enough that you can buy your groceries, and if you have to haul water, maybe you can get water tanks like the IBC totes that are in those crates that are clean. If you can fill those with water and bring them back, all your water is going to taste nasty like plastic, but at least if you can pull that up next to your door and just leave it in the truck and siphon it off when you need it and do that, that would be doable too. If you had livestock, you would be going through a lot of water that way, and you would need somebody to be designated just to be the go-getter for the water. And also, don't assume that just because you're on the land now that you don't need groceries. I would never go off-grid without having a year's supply of food storage, because homesteading and going off-grid can be very expensive, and if you don't have bulk goods and you can't keep yourself from going into town to eat at McDonald's, your money runs away very quickly trying to get projects finished. And if you're trying to get your homestead put together and have that be off-grid, the likelihood of your first year of gardening to be a success is very slim, and it'll take time to build up a food system and to build up your soil in a way that it can support life and feed you. So going off-grid is a very time-consuming, probably worthwhile thing to do, but to recognize that it takes 5 years to get soil to the point where you can really eat from it if it's been neglected, or if it's parched because there's not enough water there. And it's a Herculean task to go off-grid. It's a Herculean task to farm, let alone go off-grid, and especially with children it can be very difficult. And that's why I think that kind of going halfway, maybe being on the grid, and as you get your food systems up and everything, get solar panels and try to wean yourself off grid and have a wood stove so that you're not using a furnace, and get that off grid. And I think that the better way to go, especially if you have young children, is to start on grid and start with animals and start with the garden and do that. And as your children age, implementing systems that help you to be self-reliant and not be taxing your system. As a mom and as a father, my dad, when we went off grid, my dad's hair went from black to salt and pepper within 2 years while building our home. And he did everything. He had the battery house. We actually had a cow fall down the battery house before we had stairs in, and we had to figure out how to get the steer out of the battery house. He had the solar panels back in the 90s. We had our very own well. We had a 500-gallon milk tank that he had in our bomb shelter that was to store water. And our well was run off of solar panels. We had a root cellar, a real root cellar with blast shelter doors and the air filtration system. I mean, my dad put his lifeblood into that house. And then as my parents aged, they weren't able to keep up with it anymore. And I think a lot of that had to do with trying to do all of it at once and trying to, when you got 7 kids, by the time they were done having kids, my mom had been breastfeeding for, 19 years. And when she wasn't breastfeeding, well, usually she was pregnant and breastfeeding at the same time. And so she was physically drained, and my dad had been making a living and trying to keep the farm going all at the same time, and he was physically drained. And I think there gets to a point where you just ask too much of yourself, especially if you're raising small children. Small children are an exhausting drain on energy, time, and money. And so going off grid and trying to do it in a big way, I think if you're trying to do it in a small way and you give yourself allowances, it's doable. And it can be lovely, and it can be a really big growing experience. I would say, remember that anything you don't put in money has to be put in time. And remember that anything you don't put in time has to be done with money. And I think one of the big problems was that my parents didn't eat enough when they were trying to do this. They were running full tilt and weren't taking enough time for regular meals, and we never ever took vacations. There were no vacations in my childhood. We would do little visits for a day or two to my grandparents' cabin, which was kind of the same as what we were already doing. But we never like went across state to go do something fun just as a family. Everything was work, 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 work. And I think that's hard on kids. I think not being able to look at parents and know that they love you, whether or not you're working really, really hard, and to have time to do things like daddy-daughter dates and mommy-son dates and vice versa, I think that's essential. And I know that my parents really, really tried. They tried to do their best for us, and I think it has paid them back in seeing kids that have been really successful with their lives. And I look back at it and I wish that my parents hadn't had it so hard. I think of everybody that had it hard, they had it the hardest because they were the ones that were just working themselves to death for this dream, this enormous dream. And I think it would have been more doable if it had been done on a smaller scale and if they had been kinder to themselves. So think of kindness for yourself if you want to go off grid and do these amazing things. And I think it's a great thing to do. And it can be an adventure for your kids, but watch for that point where it stops being an adventure and it starts to be drudgery. And at that point, it doesn't mean you give up. It means that you make sure you tweak things so that it's a happiness. It's a lifestyle of happiness rather than a lifestyle of we have to because we're afraid the end of the world is coming. So